Last week, the Telegraph's defence and security editor Dominic Knowles and myself were in Ukraine to see what life is like on the ground in the country. All of those episodes are available to listen back to, including interviews with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, Olga Stefanishyna, Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and some more of our own reflections of our time exploring Kyiv, and, for myself, Bucha. I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the front lines of the invasion of Ukraine, look at the shipment of Ukrainian grain that left Odessa this morning, and we examine how the Russian economy might be in a far worse position than the Kremlin pretends. Finally, after reporting from Kyiv, I sat down with Anna Vertsan, who had previously shown me around the city to reflect on everything we had seen.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 1st of August, day 159. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's defence and security editor, Dominic Knowles, and economics reporter, Louis Ashworth. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. Just quickly, it was last week. It was last Thursday, actually, but we need to mark it because you and I were on the road out in Ukraine last week. We weren't able to mark this on Friday, but we shouldn't let it pass. That last Thursday there was a horrendous or two horrendous incidents that came to light from Ukraine. The first was the attack on an area in Donbass, Olenivska. This is an area in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, an area that was holding over 50, thought to be around 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war, many from the Azovstal plant, the Mariupol plant you may remember from a few months ago. This site was attacked by munitions unknown and people unknown and completely destroyed. So over 50 people killed there, 50 of the Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now this is absolutely against the Geneva Convention. If you are a prisoner of war, you are protected. You should be protected by the power that's holding you. You should also be removed from the combat zone as quickly as possibly, as expeditious a manner as possible. So, bearing in mind, if they had been taken from the Azovstal plant, these people shouldn't have been there. These men should have been moved well to the rear weeks ago, so they shouldn't have been there. And secondly, Russia are blaming Ukraine for this. They're blaming Ukraine, and they're saying it was a HIMARS attack. So the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system, the very precise, very long range weapons that had been supplied by America. And I think this was an effort by Russia to discredit both Ukraine and also the HIMARS as a weapon system. Now, Ukraine said it wasn't them, said it was Russia. It was a false flag attack. They said this location in what they're calling the temporarily occupied territory of the Donetsk, self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, was long known as a holding facility. So there's no way they would have targeted it. And if you look at the photographs from the site, it was literally just the small part of the small building where these men were being held that was destroyed in that location. So it was a very precise strike. And Ukraine is saying, well, if they were going to, why target that particular area that was known to be a holding facility? They just simply wouldn't have done it. And the suggestion is, and some evidence to suggest that the way that the building has been, not blown apart. Basically, HIMARS would vastly destroy the entire place, whereas this has been, the structure is largely intact and it's been subject to an intense fire. That is a very different munition to HIMARS, and the suggestion is that it was a Russian thermobaric weapon that causes mass fires and will destroy the place from within. Because if you look at some of the pictures that helpfully have been put out by Russia, there are sort of neat rows of beds still in place, albeit just the metal bed frames. But everything's been burnt to a cinder. But you can see the metal bed frames all lined up, and they would have been utterly destroyed and scattered over a large area if it had been a HIMARS attack. So it looks like it was a Russian attack. Now, why would they do it? If these men have been were from the Azovstal plant, the big steel plant down in Mariupol, then if they'd ever come home in some sort of prisoner swap or years to come, they would of course have been feted as heroes. And I think Russia was calculating, or the suggestion is Russia's calculating, they just couldn't handle the propaganda victory that would have been for Ukraine. So a disgraceful episode. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to get any evidence out of that area soon. So you've kind of got to just sort of take your money, take your choice, sort of thing, of who you think is responsible. But regardless of who was responsible, and I personally think it was Russia, but regardless of who was responsible, those men should not have been there under the Geneva Convention. As I say, they should have been moved to a rear area as quickly as possible to maintain their safety. So that was number one. And secondly, there was footage of a gross attack. Russian soldiers holding down a Ukrainian soldier and subjecting him to an absolutely horrific attack, where he was castrated with a box cutting knife. I mean, just disgusting. And this went out on a Russian Telegram channel, and then was leaked more widely on social media. So it's just yet more evidence of the dehumanizing aspect of this war, and the way that there's just mounting evidence of increasing war crimes, just running all the way through the whole chain of command, from the sick individuals at ground level up through an utterly morally bankrupt, intellectually corrupt organisation that would plan an attack on prisoners of war. So not a good way to start the week off, I'm afraid. That was last week. There's a number of different bits and bobs happened over the weekend, but I'll just take a little pause there because I think I'm going to run into the grain issue, which I think we're going to discuss more broadly. But I'll just take a little pause there.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, Louis, let's turn to you. Louis Ashworth. Big moment this morning. The first shipment carrying Ukrainian grain is set off from the port of Odessa. Can you tell us about this? What's happening and why is it significant?
Hi, yes, and thank you for having me on, David. And it's good to have you back. The Rizzoni, which is a Sierra Leone flagged cargo ship, set off from Odessa at 7:15 this morning. This is a significant event. It's the first sort of movement of a ship following the agreement that was reached between Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, sort of Turkey brokered deal that was signed on July 22nd in Istanbul. So this ship has moved out. It's loaded with corn and it's heading to Lebanon. This is significant in and of itself because it's the first shipment via the Black Sea that Ukraine has been able to make since the conflict first began. And we're expecting it to hopefully be the first of many further shipments. There are, according to Alexander Kubakov, who is the Ukraine's infrastructure minister, there are about 16 ships that are ready to go. And what we're expecting to see occur from here is a number of ships that have been for the last few months sort of docked at various ports on the Black Sea are going to form caravans and will go out together in those caravans to make deliveries. This is a huge deal because, as I'm sure many listeners recall, a big part of this entire conflict has been that it's knocked out what is known as one of the breadbaskets of the world. Ukraine and also the adjacent region of Russia is a hugely important area for the production of a lot of grain products and also sunflower oil. And that entire supply was basically been knocked out by the conflict. And what we're seeing here are the first signs that some of that capacity is coming back online, which is hugely important because the market for grains has been very, very tight over the last months. It hasn't been made any easier by the fact that there's been a heat wave in Europe and also North America. So overall, in the context of the huge inflationary pressures that are being felt in several parts of the world, this is a very important step that this has occurred.
Thanks, Louis. Dom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Maybe comment on the claim from Russians that Sevastopol suffered a drone attack over the weekend as well.
Yeah, so Sevastopol, a big port in Crimea. Russia's saying there was a drone attack there. I don't think anyone was killed. I think it's five injured, but they're suggesting that was Ukraine. There was a naval facility there, I believe, in Sevastopol. Now, whether or not that was, I can't see how that would necessarily be linked necessarily to grain. I mean, we know Russia, and I'll mention in a moment, Russia like marking these events, marking notable sort of developments with a little knee-jerk kidney punch around the side. I don't think that's necessarily how Ukraine have been operating. So not quite entirely sure what happened in Sevastopol, but there are reports that a drone strike has wounded a number of people. But in relation to the actual grain shipment today out of Odessa, and Alexander Kubikov saying that this could be the first of many. I mean, it's the first of 16 under current plans, but he's saying that we should be able to, or they should be able to, look forward to getting grain out of Mykolaiv in the future. I think that might be a little bit ambitious for now. Let's see how this first one goes. I mean, this move has already been supported on social media by Boris Johnson, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, Liz Truss, who's the vying to be the next Prime Minister of the UK, and the EU as well have supported it. So what should we expect from Russia? Because this obviously is one of the big issues, big international issues. We saw last week Sergei Lavrov in various African countries courting opinion there and bolstering Russian support, and no doubt saying that the reason for many of the countries not getting the grain shipments they would have hoped for is Ukraine, NATO, Nazis, the West, insert baddie here type thing. So Russia have been under pressure for months now to allow the grain out, and I think that this will not go unmolested. This issue. So, what should we expect from Russia? I think there will be at some point in the near future, maybe not on this very first shipment, but I think there will be an accident in the Black Sea. I think one of the grain vessels might hit a mine. Russia will say this is a legacy Ukraine mine, and I suggest people keep an eye on H.I. Sutton's Twitter feed. That's Covert Shores, the Twitter feed. He's absolutely all over the naval matters, especially Russian submarine activity. So I think that we should keep an eye on there. What else should we look at? Well, of course, over the weekend, Mykolaiv was subjected to a big attack, a big artillery attack, in which a tycoon, Alexei Vadytursky, and his wife were killed. And Mr. Vadytursky was a big tycoon in the Ukraine's grain industry. So I think this was a targeted strike. From the images of his house, it was a very precise strike. Houses left and right were untouched. It was very. It was either an extremely poor accident, bad luck, but I don't think it was. What else should we look at? Well, a little bit wider. There's currently a lot of tension between Serbia and Kosovo. Serbia historically very close to Russia. Now, this on the face of it has nothing to do with Ukraine, and I'm not directly linking the two. This is the immediate response for this, or the immediate catalyst for the problem there has been border issues with Serbs moving into Kosovo. However, there are now tensions. NATO have put out a press release this morning saying KFOR, that's the Kosovo force, the NATO force that's been there since the 1999 war. KFOR is prepared to, this is a quote, prepared to intervene if stability is jeopardized, unquote. That's under the UN mandate that exists. And another quote says, KFOR will take whatever measures are necessary to keep a safe and secure environment in Kosovo at all times, unquote. So whatever measures are necessary. Why can't I say that word? Whatever measures are necessary, that obviously includes armed action. So, this could be, I'm not a conspiracy theorist looking for reds under the beds in every angle. However, it is notable to say that in the near abroad from Ukraine, a very close ally, Serbia, very close ally of Russia, having conflict with a NATO entity is possibly not unhelpful for Russia. And just one other thing to notice is that on Sunday morning in Bulgaria, an arms depot went up in smoke. This arms depot is owned by Bulgarian arms dealer Emilian Gabrev, who himself, he was poisoned in 2015. The Kremlin was implicated in that attack, and this follows expulsion last year by Bulgaria of a Russian diplomat, citing 4 similar blasts of ammunition sites in the country that we know supply Ukraine. 4 blasts over the last 10 years, and six Russian citizens, and they were suspected of being part of the GRU's Unit 29155, which is the lot that tried to kill Sergei Skripal in the UK with a nerve agent in May 2018. They are thought to have been responsible for those ammunition blasts. So there's a number of ways I think Russia are trying to hit back. So if things aren't going their way with the grain, i.e. they've been forced finally to allow grain out of the country, I think they are using whatever response they can in a different sphere and a different time and place to hit back. I don't know if this is all coordinated. I mean, I'm not suggesting, certainly with the Serbia thing, I'm not suggesting that the tensions there with KFOR and NATO is directly linked to Ukraine, although it is, as I say, all helpful. But it's just very, very notable that Russia does like to lash out in a different sphere with a different issue and a different scale and time when it suits its purpose. So just keep an eye on the wider diplomatic developments as this Ukraine issue goes on.
Thanks, Dom. Louis, I'll come to you next, just because I know you've got some things to add on the Ukraine issue. But Dom, very quickly, the UK's Ministry of Defence has said that it thinks Russia is likely reallocating a significant number of its forces from the northern Donbass sector to the south of Ukraine. Can you just talk us quickly through what they mean and why the Russians might be doing this?
So since Russia was ejected from the north of the country in the first few weeks of the war, they then said, Putin said that actually all along the objective has been the Donbass, so to take the Donetsk and the Luhansk oblasts in the east of the country. So after a few weeks, the Russian army regrouped and was pushing into the east, and we've seen that over the last few months. Very slow, grinding, attritional movement, very artillery led, very heavy fires. I mean, most people are being killed on both sides, being killed by artillery. There's not a lot of direct close contact between infantry or armoured forces, what have you. It's mostly artillery that's doing all the killing. And Russia did make gains and took the town, the strategic town of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the east, but really, at huge cost, firstly, and not at a pace that we would expect an army of Russia's size. Since then, the HIMARS and other multiple launch rocket systems and other heavy weaponry have flowed into Ukraine, and they were able to target ammunition dumps, command and control centres, fuel depots in Russia's rear, and absolutely ground their advance to a halt. So in the centre, if you like, the centre of the country, the Donbass region, that battlefield has moved very little in the last few weeks. Meanwhile, in the south, around Kherson, which was the first city, the only notable city actually, the biggest piece of urban terrain that Russia has taken from Ukraine in this war, Ukrainian forces have been pushing back. Now, these are local counterattacks at the moment. It hasn't yet morphed into a large counteroffensive. A counterattack can be small raiding parties. It can be small mobile troops with vehicles or on foot, just testing, probing defences. A counteroffensive is an entirely different ballgame. I mean, you've got to have everything backed up there. You've got to knit all your forces together. You've got to have a long-term plan. You've got to have a few other plans up your sleeve for when the first one goes wrong, etc., etc. So I think what we've been seeing in the south is these probing attacks, looking for any weak points and just testing to see where Russia will potentially falter. And this has obviously gone. Part of this has been the destruction thought to be by HIMARS of the bridges over the Dnieper River. And there's a small contingent of Russian forces that have made it north and west of the Dnieper River. That's a strategically advantageous position. So to cut them off is quite helpful from Ukraine's point of view. And the south is the fight. I mean, it's one thing to say Russia wants to take the Donbass, the largely Russian-speaking area of Ukraine, but the south is where the fight is. I mean, we're seeing that today with the grain shipment. Russia wants to take the south so that Ukraine is then no longer a viable, economically prosperous, independent, successful state. So the south is the fight. Obviously, the south also leads directly to Crimea. So Ukraine needs to prioritise the south, and I think is prioritising the south. And Russia, as a consequence of the recent attacks and possibly of the grinding nature of the war in the Donbass, and how Ukraine in that area would have to really get a huge numbers of armoured forces, which they don't currently have, to make any territorial gains there. So Ukraine don't seem likely to push against Russia in the Donbass anytime soon. And so Russia, I think, have calculated that they can move some forces and need to move forces from that area down to the south to shore up Kherson and shore up the any future emerging threat to Crimea. Now, this might be absolute super counter bluff from Ukraine to get Russia to start splitting its forces. I mean, these are hundreds of kilometers apart. So to move vehicles and move personnel and the whole logistic tail from the center to the south and then maybe back up again if there's another attack in the Donbass or maybe further north around Kyiv. I mean, this might be Ukraine trying to wear out Russia's logistical system by getting them to move We don't know, or it might be genuinely that they are building up in the south for an attack on Kherson, and Russia have to move to bolster their defences there. But I mean, it's interesting that we're now talking about Russia bolstering its defences rather than going on sweeping armoured advances through the flat Ukrainian countryside. I mean, that sort of says where we are currently with the war. So I think it's very interesting to keep a firm eye on what's happening there in the south and to see whether or not any of these local counterattacks are morphed together into a wider counteroffensive.
Thanks, Dom. I mean, you said several things that sort of touched on the market implications of grain movement and the economy in Ukraine's south. Louis, I don't know if you want to come in on that before we talk more broadly about the Russian economy.
Thanks, David. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the really important things I think to take away from this is to remember that one of the biggest victims of this conflict, outside of obviously, the people of Ukraine, has actually been people living in areas like the Middle East and North Africa. These areas that historically have been very, very reliant upon Ukraine's grain exports as a sort of staple foodstuff. And I think it's actually very important that we're seeing this first grain shipment going out to Lebanon. Because Lebanon, since at least 2019, has been in a financial crisis. We obviously here in the UK, we're wringing our hands over inflation, running at 9.4%. I think the latest available official figures for Lebanon put inflation there at around 210%. So you're talking about prices sort of tripling in a year. It's added further excruciation to a very difficult time for the Lebanese people. And so it's very important that we're seeing, on a sort of humanitarian level, that we're seeing this food go out again. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just been the Ukraine conflict that's caused troubles in the global grain market. We saw prices on the sort of the UN Food Agricultural Organization's indices of food prices hit a record high in the direct aftermath of the conflict. They then, in sort of April and May, they were cooling off a little bit, and we were seeing a sort of sustained period of falling prices. But in recent days, we've seen a bit of a reversal again, or recent weeks rather, and that's because the very extreme weather that we've been experiencing. Obviously, I'm sure any listeners who are in the UK and several other parts of the world will be aware of just how hot things have got recently. That is the most visible part of what actually has been a very sustainedly dry 2022 so far, and that is expected to really knock crop yields in Europe and in North America. For instance, France is a huge wheat producer and has seen these sort of very almost drought-like conditions for a lot of this year. Michael Magdovitz, who's a senior commodities analyst at Rabobank, reckons that if the corridor is able to be sustained through the Black Sea, we'll see corn exports more than double out of Ukraine. Obviously, as we've discussed before, they've had some other ways, mainly sort of land-based options like trains to transport grains out during this conflict. Michael expects these exports to double. That would be enough to offset the shortfall that there's been from the US and the EU. So hugely significant in terms of the global picture. I mean, that will be the difference between there being grain or not in some parts of the world. So it's very important. He says if this corridor proves even reasonably successful, it will go a long way to alleviating shortages of grains across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. So very important element to that there. And it is one of those things where I'm sure that the conflict of the timing of this conflict with this particularly difficult year for general grain production is a coincidence. It would have been, I'm quite sure, too early to know how difficult this year was going to be at the time when Russia invaded, but it really has piled on the pain from this particular sort of element of the conflict. The big question now is going to be, as Dom said, are we going to see a sustained period of these ships being able to consistently traverse the Black Sea? Is there going to be an event soon in which a ship is damaged, destroyed, people are injured, hurt, the shipment is lost? And if that does occur, will that lead to cold feet among traders? Will they not want to risk the Black Sea route? So it's a very important thing to watch, and it's a there's a market element to it, there's an economic element to it, but there really is a very strong humanitarian element to it, because if for as long as these shipments are blocked, it's torturous for people in some parts of particularly North Africa. It's an extremely difficult situation for them. So it's good for the market that we're seeing this supply come back online. It's very good for some people, and so we can only really hope that this is sustainable.
Thank you, Louis. Louis, you've been coming on these spaces in this podcast for months now, always talking about the economy, and we've been looking in some detail at the Russian economy. You've been sort of tracking it, I think, for the past few months, looking at the impact of sanctions, looking at the impact of the exodus of Western firms. You wrote an article last week. The lead quote is that the Russian economy has been crippled at every level, but you argue that potentially it's actually worse than what the Kremlin are saying. Could you give us a sense of just how bad the Russian economy has got since the start of the war?
Sure. So there's a very important sort of narrative going on here, in that obviously, as Dom has intricately described, the complexities and the back and forth of this land war that is going on. There's also been this hugely important backdrop of the sanctions war behind everything, the Russia versus the West financial clash. And one of the things that's sort of to massively simplify the narrative of that, as it's tended to be, it's been the West hits Russia extremely hard with sanctions at the beginning of the conflict. The ruble plunges. Russia is expected to be devastated. And then we saw a few weeks after that, we started to realize how bad the inflation impact was going to be. We started to realize how bad the growth impact was going to be. We started to realize how expensive all the things associated with this are. And we also started to get to realize just how resilient Russia's economy is. And that's kind of developed into a narrative from some corners of Russia is winning the financial conflict. And there's always been something of a mirage. I mean, people have been making this argument a lot in recent days. One thing people look at a lot when they're talking about this, or two things rather. One is these are interconnected factors. One is the strength of the ruble, which after plunging at the start of the conflict, very quickly regained ground and actually has become strong to an extent where it's worrying for Russia. A lot of people will look simply at the ruble and say, the ruble is strong, Russia is doing well, Russia is winning, and it's far more complicated than that. In terms of the ruble itself, there's at least three important things to take into account. One of which is that the ruble strength is purely a function of Russia's, or largely a function of Russia's trade surplus. The second part of that is that what may be the theoretical exchange rate for a ruble in Russia is not necessarily how much a ruble is actually worth. And that's because of the third factor, which is rubles are not that useful if you've been so sufficiently sanctioned that you can't spend your rubles on as much. So just to get some issues there. The other side of it, a lot of people will look at Russia's trade surplus and say Russia's trade surplus hit a record high at the start of this year. Therefore, they must be doing really well. They don't need the West. A factor of that is that Russia's exports have boomed because of how expensive oil is, but you can't look at a trade surplus as only one side. Russia's imports have dropped extremely sharply. We're not quite sure how sharply, but it appears to be quite severe. And that is not a good thing. It is not a good thing if your country's... there's a maybe very simple way of looking at it where you say, I'm not as reliant on other people, that's a good thing. The simple fact is that if you were importing large amounts of products and suddenly you stop, it is a sign of something going very wrong in your economy. I mean, if one day you, David, were to decide to not do your weekly supermarket shop, you wouldn't be patting yourself on the back saying, oh yes, I've become extremely self-reliant. You'd probably be quite hungry. And a sort of extension of that is what is occurring in Russia. We've seen some of this optimism, though, in some ways about Russia's economy being reflected in forecasts. The IMF last week adjusted its forecast for Russia to say that it expects Russia's economy to contract just 6% this year. That's substantially less steep than earlier predictions were. And similarly, the IMF says that Russian exports have been holding up better than expected and that domestic demand is stronger than expected. A very interesting paper that's come into this is one that's been released by Yale recently, which it's been conducted by Yale's Chief Executive Leadership Institute, what they've done basically is they've looked beyond the headline figures that are being released by the Kremlin. And an important thing to note here is that the Kremlin has significantly reduced the amount of data that it's releasing since the conflict began, which, if anything, is going to give you a signal that something might be awry. I would say a government hiding a bunch of data is an important one. So what these analysts at Yale did is they looked at a sort of range of other data sources, most of which are sort of ones that are beyond the Kremlin's influence. So they looked at non-public analyses carried out by investment banks. They looked at certain kinds of bespoke high-frequency data that other private companies are putting together. They've looked at the sort of releases by international partners. So rather than looking at Russia's side of the stats on things like trade, they've looked at the stats from other countries. And they've also been through a cache of sort of Russian documents and internal memos and that kind of thing. And the conclusion they've come to, as you said, is that Russia's economy is being catastrophically crippled. They say that domestic production in Russia has come to a complete standstill, and its imports have collapsed. And this is a very difficult thing. Obviously they're having to work around with unusual data sources. They've been having to. They can't simply go through the official channels here. But their conclusion is that this idea that's been building up and has been spouted by some, that Russia's economy is actually doing fine, is a complete illusion. They say Kremlin finances are in much, much more dire straits than conventionally understood. It's a really interesting report. It can be found if you look up Yale's Chief Executive Leadership Institute. You can read this report online. It's very interesting. They go very in depth about the things that they've looked at and the ways that they've sort of analysed this data. One of their big findings is that the exit. So about 1,000 companies are thought to have exited Russia since the conflict began. 1,000 Western companies. They say that's wiped out revenues and investments exceeding $600 billion, which is equivalent to about 40% of Russian GDP. Now, the relationship between company investments and GDP is a little bit complicated because GDP it's an annual output thing. It's not a kind of sustained investment thing, but it gives a sense of the scale of the exit that's occurred. The analysts say this isn't going to have an immediate impact necessarily. It's not going to, the exit of McDonald's isn't going to cause Russia's economy to collapse, but it's going to force them into a sort of unwanted involuntary economic transformation. It's going to cause huge dislocation of staff. It's going to lead to a lot of sort of stranded resources. There's a lot of potential investment that would have occurred that will now not occur. All these things add up. Their assessment of it is that the Kremlin has basically been cherry picking the data that it sets out, and it's made Russia look a lot better than things actually are. So, very interesting report. As I said, I'd really encourage people to go out and give it a read. And it's offering a very interesting, I would say quite compelling sort of counterpoint to that narrative that has been building that Russia is somehow winning the economic war here.
That was masterful, Louis. Thank you. I've just got one question. If this report is reliable and is, for the most part correct in its conclusions, what do you think we will start seeing in the Russian economy and the Russian government in the next few weeks and months? What kind of steps might we see being taken? What kind of what kind of events, if the Russian economy is doing far worse than people think, or that they're saying, how will that manifest itself in the next few months?
It's a difficult one to say, and if we're to follow the premise of this report, and also, if we're to follow the sort of general modus operandi of the Kremlin, we might not expect them to be super transparent about what it is that they're doing. But the Kremlin, if they are experiencing this economic slowdown, will be looking at ways that they can support their domestic economy, they can support demand. So a couple of very typical ways you'd look at that would be some kind of fiscal stimulus from the Kremlin, which they may not want to be hugely upfront about it. They may be wanting to find ways that they can channel more money into the economy quietly. The other part of this is interest rates. So Russia's interest rates were cranked up and were made very high at the beginning of the conflict because they wanted to strengthen the ruble. They've then been able to sort of generally peel back that increase and lower interest rates in order to curb the ruble's gain. If the economy needs stimulation, then the typical approach would be to continue to cut interest rates, because by cutting interest rates, you lower the cost of borrowing, and therefore you stimulate activity because people borrow more and they spend more. And also by lowering interest rates, you'd make it less lucrative for investors to hold rubles, and therefore that would weaken the ruble and make Russia's exports more competitive. Those are sort of the two things we might expect to see. So I think the first part of that, the fiscal side of it, we may not quickly get a clear idea of what, if anything, is being done there. The monetary side of it, the interest rates, that is public. Russia can't really hide what its central bank is doing without sort of utterly destroying its credibility. So it will be interesting to see whether they are tempted to, for instance, cut interest rates to lower than where they were before the conflict began. And if they do, that is probably a good sign that the economy needs stimulation.
Thank you, Louis. I know that Dom has a question for you as well.
I do. Hi, Louis. If or absent any great breakthrough on the battlefield for either side, and I don't see that happening anytime soon in the next few months, could you give us an idea of how important this proposed IMF loan to Ukraine of up to 20 billion would be for keeping them in the fight, just keeping their economy going, to keep them in the fight, such that when the military situation changes in due course, they are still there to be able to take advantage of that military situation?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, journalists, I think, often aren't always the best at predicting things. I am surprised that the situation in Ukraine has been allowed to go the way that it has in terms of defaults being allowed to occur in Ukraine. I would have thought there would have been given the extent to which during this conflict we've seen Western financial institutions break norms and take steps they wouldn't normally do. I was expecting to see some kind of earlier action, sort of pre-forgiveness for Ukrainian default. As it stands, as you said, Ukraine is having to go to the IMF for money, and there have been defaults in some elements of Ukrainian operations. It's still a difficult one. The IMF bailout is needed. Whether if it didn't occur, Ukraine would simply stop working is a sort of it's complicated because, again, it's hard to know how strongly Ukraine's creditors would have chased debts that defaulted. Having the money there is very important. I think there probably will be perhaps more of a temptation from the West to provide more direct financial support as a result of this. It's sort of shutting the door after the horse has bolted a little bit. But I think an intervention needed to be done early here. In the event it wasn't, this default's been allowed to happen. They have to go to the IMF. It's not a very good look. I would say it's difficult to say. It is needed, though. I'm just surprised that it happened.
Louis, before we move to our final thoughts from Dom and yourself, is there anything else about the Russian economy or indeed the Ukrainian economy you think our listeners should know today?
Oh, so one of the other interesting things that we've had going on. I mean, I spoke a few weeks ago about the trade in Russian oil. Just as a sort of quick summary, I mean, Russian seaborne oil is going to be sanctioned by the EU from the end of this year, at which point it will be illegal to sell Russian oil within Europe. We've also seen a lot of companies and countries essentially self-sanctioning and not accepting Russian oil. One interesting development that's occurred recently is analysts at Lloyd's List, which is a sort of maritime intelligence firm associated with Lloyd's of London, which is the sort of big insurance market in London, have tracked a number of vessels that basically they've created a kind of sort of improvised dock area in the mid-Atlantic. So what's happened is a company based in China has leased a number of old VLCCs, which are basically these sort of supersized oil tankers, and has docked them together in the Atlantic. And what ships are doing is they're leaving ports in Russia. They're heading round into the Atlantic, and sort of quite far off in international waters off the coast from Portugal. They are docking next to these Chinese tankers, transferring their oil on the high seas, and then those tankers are carrying on off towards East Asia, which is a very, well, I mean, analysts say unprecedented thing to do. I mean, it's dangerous enough to transfer goods between two ships in the middle of the sea. To do it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is hugely dangerous. These ships are almost certainly they're not being insured in any major market. Analysts say that they are going to be having to use their own sort of specially trained crews in order to carry out these actions. It's a very strange sort of clandestine operation, and it's we spoke a few weeks ago about how important this kind of undercover market for Russian oil is likely to become as the world kind of weans itself off Russian oil, and there become sort of fewer and fewer people who are willing to accept it. But this is very sort of interesting development that they would go to these kind of extremes to create a kind of impromptu flotilla in the middle of a very calamitous ocean in order to make these transfers. And it shows how some companies in China are so keen to get their hands on this discounted Russian crude. Russian oil's been trading, it varies, but around the sort of $30 a barrel discount to Brent, which is the global benchmark. You add that up, it's extremely lucrative, and we know that Chinese companies have been trying to get their hands on that. So interesting to see how that is continuing to develop.
Well, thank you, Lou. That's an extraordinary development. So so we think that it's mainly Chinese companies buying this oil from this flotilla in the Atlantic, or other parties as well?
So the tankers that have been leased are all affiliated with one company based in Dalian, which is a Chinese city. Not much is known beyond that. It's registered to an address. I think it's a sort of shell company of some description based there. We don't know much more about who's actually behind it. There's a precedent for China being willing to get its hands dirty when it comes to sanctioned oil. China has for a number of years found ways to get its hands on particularly Iranian oil shipments. So it's likely similar players, big Chinese companies who obviously are acting with the implicit approval of Beijing carrying out these kind of actions. But for now, we don't know for sure. We can't say.
Well, thank you very much, Louis, and thank you, Dom. It just goes for me to ask you both for your final thoughts. What should our listeners be thinking of and looking to over the next few days in the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think there's going to be a bit of blowback from Russia about grain. They're not going to allow this to go unmarked. And I wonder if the issues I spoke of earlier in Bulgaria and Kosovo and what have you are their answer to it. They seem at one stage removed, if indeed they are connected. So I think there will be something. That might be Putin's speech yesterday in St. Petersburg for Navy Day when he was talking about some amazing new missile that's hypersonic and it's going to do this and it's going to do that. And I sort of zoned out, to be honest. So I'm not quite sure if that was it, but there will be some kind of response from Russia. Maybe not immediately, but I think we should keep an eye on the Black Sea. Like I say, have a look at Covert Shores on Twitter. H. Sutton there, great analyst, and keeping a very firm eye on all things that are happening there. So that would be my response.
Thank you, Dom. And Louis, would you like the final words?
I think I'm likely to echo Dom a lot here. It's as I said, there are 16 ships that are still waiting or are currently basically in the queue to try and go through the Black Sea. If they make it out, the amount of grain that they're going to carry is equivalent to half of the exports that the grain exports that Ukraine has been able to get out since the war began. So we're talking about 16 ships carrying about 15% of what otherwise has taken 5 months to do. So it's going to be an incredible uptick in exports that has a huge impact for the rest of the world if they're able to go ahead. And I think people are going to be watching and praying that those ships make it through safe.
That was Louis Ashworth, our economics reporter, finishing off today's live segment. Last Tuesday, I met up with Anna Vertsan, who showed me around Kyiv, pointing out places of interest, and we talked a lot about the war and how it impacted the capital and its life.
Feelings, because this is Michael Square. This is a very memorable place for our revolution in 2014, and the St. Michael's Church is also a very memorable place.
At the end of my time in Kyiv, we met for lunch, and I took the opportunity to ask her a few questions, looking back over the week, and her thoughts about what might be to come. Just sitting outside having a milkshake with Anna Versen. It's lovely to see Anna again. You'll remember Anna, she showed me around various different places in the capital. We're meeting up again. We've had a lovely lunch here in Kyiv Food Market. We're sitting outside in the cafe, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I mean, I guess the first thing to observe is just there are moments now when the war feels so far away. We had an air raid alert this morning that we all heard.
Like six air raids.
In the early morning, yeah. How do you sort of live that? On the one hand, the sort of normalness of this, of what we're doing, sitting outside having a milkshake, but also dealing with the stress and the awfulness of the war.
I think we get used with it. Like, okay, we have to hide for a while, wait for a while, just to look at the news, what happened or didn't happen. We get used to it, and we have a thought that what else we should do? Like stop living, stop existing, just wait? No, we have our lives, we have our jobs, we have our duties, we have to work, we have to pay our taxes to support army, so we're just keep going.
And today's a special day in Ukraine, Statehood Day. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it?
There are two. Today is also day when Kyiv Rus was baptized. So it was in 10th century, 998, and Knyaz Volodymyr in Kyiv baptized everyone around. But there is another side of this holiday, that the date was basically made up by the Soviet time authorities. So we don't know when exactly this happened. So the Statehood Day, it's modern holiday, if you can say so.
And it's not something you said earlier that people don't really celebrate it, but they're aware of it. It's a sort of
yes.
official.
People don't really celebrate it well because it's not very proper date to celebrate. So when you don't know the exact date, what is the matter of celebrating it? Historians very often say like it's wrong to celebrate this date, and all the authorities. It's one of the things we have like from the Soviet times, and we have to get rid of this Soviet time holidays made up just artificially. But also the amount of air raid sirens and amount of the attacks and all the shellings that happened today. I was discussing this with my friends and family. This is a very nice way from, I think, Russians think so, to celebrate this day with us, a day of Ukrainian statehood and this day of when the Kyiv Rus was baptized. So they are celebrating it like this way because they really want to be a part of this history. It's more important for them to be a part of like when the Kyiv Rus was baptized. They telling that our Knyaz Volodymyr, he was Russian and all this stuff. So it's a part of their Russian world and the propaganda of Russian world, and also church propaganda. It's very complicated. They try and as much as possible to erase us and to replace us with themselves and to show this link to our history and our state.
Anna, when you were showing me around the city on Tuesday, what were you sort of I mean, you're an archaeologist by training, historian. What were you proudest of, just to show me? What did you really want sort of people to hear about and to talk about?
Well, I think we have such rich culture, such rich history, and I think we should tell the whole world more about us. So you visited St. Sophia Cathedral, and it's part of the UNESCO heritage, and we have much more ancient, not only the buildings, but cultural and historical events, and we should share with the world. And this is also the way we can explain who we are, our background, our cultural background. And I think it's very important to popularize the history and archaeology, not only among Ukrainians. It's also a very important part of education, but in the world, just telling about Ukraine, who we are, and explaining why we are who we are, basically.
Anna, it's been absolutely lovely meeting you properly. Obviously, we spoke beforehand, and now we're in Kyiv, so Dom and I did meet you. You showed me around the city. We couldn't be more grateful for your help and your explanations and your guiding. It's been really wonderful again to see you today. We'll come back, and when you're in London, do of course let us know. Before we head off, what's been your experience of showing us your city? How have you found it?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to you for coming here, showing the world what happens, what's going on, how we live, because that's very funny stuff, but nobody knows about us and who we are. And I've told you before that there is a common thought that we are some third world country, but you saw us. We are digitalized, we're modern, we are active, we are proud, and it's very right thing now to show all the aspects of our life, not only the war. War is what grabbed the attention of the world, basically, but we are not only the war, we are more than that. And I really want people to come to Ukraine to see how beautiful our country is, how rich it is, and that we are worth of coming here and spending your precious time here. So thank you so much for telling the world what's going on, and for coming here, not just looking at the photos and videos from Ukraine, but coming here, you felt the smell of burned vehicles, Russian tanks and others. So it's another experience.
Yes, I mean, it's been an odd experience, I think, coming here. As I said at the beginning of this interview, that you walk down the street, you can see the electric trams, the people, the kids out, drinking the milkshakes, and for a second you can just sort of forget. And then, like this morning, hearing the air raid siren, so that was my first time actually hearing it properly. It's a sort of almost like a sort of double life. And as you said, you just have to you don't really have an option. You've just got to do it. But thank you so much for showing us around and for talking to us, Anna. And we'll be here again, I'm certain.
I'll be very glad to see you and to show you more.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.